Here's the bad news. You are being deceived every day, misled by people you should be able to trust. Elected representatives, government agency officials, and even some scientists, environmentalists, and environmental writers and journalists. Many of them don't even realize they are spreading falsehoods that threaten imperiled wildlife species and human communities and exacerbate the climate crisis. They are simply repeating notions and beliefs that have been stated over and over again, with seeming authority in the public dialogue about large forest fires. If you care about forests, biodiversity, and climate change, as I do, there is a significant chance that, despite your best intentions, you too have trafficked in some of these falsehoods. It's nothing to be ashamed of. I did it unknowingly for years, before I started asking critical questions and delving deeper into the evidence pertaining to forest ecosystems, wildland fires, and climate change. The challenge of solving the climate crisis is monumental, but conceptually simple. We need to rapidly move beyond fossil fuel consumption and simultaneously draw down the large, human-caused excesses of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, while helping the most vulnerable communities adapt to the climate change effects we cannot avoid. Many people in the environmental community are still laboring under the misapprehension of the late 1990s that we can effectively mitigate climate change simply by transitioning to a clean energy economy that does not rely on fossil fuels. But as the global scientific community and the United Nations have now realized, this is not nearly enough. Due to human activities, such as fossil fuel consumption and logging, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, CO2, and other greenhouse gases reached 415 parts per million in 2019, and they continue to climb, hitting 417 parts per million in June 2020, even as the global coronavirus pandemic caused a substantial reduction in fossil fuel consumption. These levels need to be well below 350 parts per million to avert the most severe human and ecological impacts of global climate change. The problem is that atmospheric CO2 has an extremely long residence time. This means that even if the world stopped consuming all fossil fuels tomorrow, most of the excess greenhouse gases would still remain in the atmosphere by the late 21st century, long after the most catastrophic effects of climate change had occurred, if we do nothing else to avert the climate crisis. Even with a 93% reduction in fossil fuel consumption over the next few decades, we would also need to dramatically decrease logging and increase forest carbon storage to overcome the worst impacts of the climate crisis. This is why forest protection is essential. Many forests around the world are currently far below their carbon sequestration and storage capacity due to many decades or centuries of logging and the removal of carbon. We can change this if we protect existing forests, including carbon-rich forests and those that may contain lower levels of carbon but could store more, and if we facilitate the recovery of native forest ecosystems in a substantial portion of the world where vast areas of forests were cleared for livestock grazing or agriculture. If we take these steps, our forests will be able to absorb far more CO2 from the atmosphere, since trees and other plants breathe in CO2 and use it to grow and to add wood to their trunks and branches. In combination with a swift move away from fossil fuels, these forest protection steps would allow us to limit temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the worst effects of climate change, including extreme heating and its direct impacts on human health, major flooding, exacerbation of drought cycles, rising sea levels, and the displacement of hundreds of millions of people in coastal communities, and the contraction of numerous ecosystems.